converted man here. I've got MaverickChristian. Hello, Maverick.
Hello.
All right. We're going to dive straight in to the argument that you posted on your community tab that I talked about at length, and you were kind enough to respond, a very lengthy response, and I responded to that, and then I realized, I'm getting caught up in the weeds of silly things. I don't need to get all the minutiae of it's a mixed hypothetical syllogism. Who cares? I don't need to get all technical. And I'm like, prove this and prove that. It's like, whatever. I sometimes my brain does that. So setting all that weirdness aside, I wanted to get to the core of what this argument is and try to figure it out with you and go over it. But so first, let's see here. I just want to see what we can agree on. If lobsters exist, basically, is reality real? And, we're not just like brains in vats or some silly syllogism or whatever. So can we agree that lobsters exist?
As far as I know, they do exist.
All right, cool. And then the next thing I want to see if we agreed on or not is if God exists or doesn't exist, our brain, mind, whatever you want to call it, can fail us in a number of ways. Do we agree on that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, moving on. So your argument is if moral knowledge exists, God exists, moral knowledge exists, God exists. Is that
That's
correct?
not quite my argument, no.
No?
No. Premise one is if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist.
Did you change it or?
No, it was like that originally. Pretty sure it was. We can check out the community post just to be sure.
Let's see. Hold on. I did not expect to have to look for that. Where is it? Let's see. Oh. Huh. Okay. Well, it's been edited. Huh. It was edited at some point last month. So, I don't know. That's interesting. Huh. Did you perchance edit it after my video? No, that can't be. Let's see.
I didn't edit that that particular premise. That premise is always like that.
No, because that was that was 8 days ago. So even if you edited it, it would have been before I did. That's interesting. Okay, well, all right. Well, whoops. Hey, somehow I made a mistake. It happens. I don't know how it happens, but
well, they are pretty similar.
It's very very weird when that happens. I don't know. Sure. Anyways, okay. So all right. Whoopsie daisy. Kind of changes a few things, but not really. But okay.
Well, while you're doing that, I could describe what I mean by morality, because I've seen that atheists and theists often talk past each other when it comes to morality.
I'm not really worried too much about that. I just want to focus on the first premise. So what is the association causation link between God and moral knowledge?
So to justify the first premise, I don't quite go through causation or association. So what I do to justify it is like basically this. I assume for sake of argument that God does not exist, and then include, okay, is it true, given God's not existent, that moral knowledge does not exist? And one of my justifications for that is that given God's not existence, we would have the same intuitions of morality existing regardless of whether morality existed. And that seems to undercut such intuition for properly justifying our belief in morality. And because moral wrongness is empirically undetectable, we have to rely on intuition to know whether morality exists. And if we can't rely on that, then we don't have moral knowledge. That's it in a nutshell.
So we could be wrong about what we intuit.
With respect to moral intuition, yeah, because we'd have the same intuitions of morality existing, regardless of whether morality existed. So imagine a metal detector that says there's metal underneath here, but it says there's metal underneath, regardless whether there's metal underneath. Well, then we can't rely on the metal detector to give us knowledge of whether there's metal underneath. It's the same thing with intuition, with moral intuition.
But we already agreed that whether there's a God or not, that doesn't change that we can't trust our minds all the time. So we could even if there's a God, it doesn't guarantee that our moral intuition is correct.
Well, remember, this argument is logically valid, which means that the premises are true and the conclusion is correct, regardless of what else might be true. So even if it is true that God doesn't solve the problem, that doesn't affect the justification of this particular premise. This premise doesn't say that God solves the problem.
So what's the connection though? What are you saying?
So my justification for this premise, remember, what does this premise say? This premise just says that if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. That is all this premise says. It doesn't say that God solves the problem of moral knowledge. It doesn't even say that moral knowledge exists. It doesn't say that God exists. It just says that if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. Now, as long as that's true, this premise is true, regardless of what else is true.
Okay, so I want to kind of get into a couple of reductio ad absurdums I had here. If moral knowledge exists, and I can't spell knowledge apparently, we'll just pretend like I spelled that right. It happens, this is nothing but professionalism. God does not exist. And then the rest, would be moral knowledge exists, so God doesn't exist. And so, and then I could say, well, if lobsters exist, then, if lobsters don't exist, then God doesn't exist. And I could say then, but lobsters do exist, so therefore God does exist. And what would that be the same thing, basically?
I don't see how. I don't see how any of this really addresses the truth or justification of this premise.
Well, if lobsters don't exist, then God doesn't exist, but lobsters do exist, so therefore God does exist.
I see little reason to believe that the premises of this argument are true.
Oh, okay. So lobsters don't exist.
No, I didn't say that. The idea was that if lobsters exist and God does not exist, was that the premise you talked about?
Yeah, right.
I see little reason to believe that premise is true.
Why?
If lobsters do not, well, you haven't given any justification to accept this premise.
Well, you didn't either.
I did give justification for premise one. I said that if we rely on
intuition... Where? No. I know you gave it here, but where in your argument did you give that?
You mean just these two statements?
Yeah, where in your argument is that?
Okay, so how deductive arguments work is you state the premises and then you give justification for these premises. So the justification isn't within these premises here.
Okay.
So
the argument cannot stand on its own and requires additional argumentation. So this should really be a conclusion of a separate argument then.
You could I suppose you could put it that way, but I did give.
But what would be the what would be the difference between saying, if morals exist, then there's no God, and morals exist, so there's no God?
Well, I don't see any reason to believe that's a sound argument.
Why not?
You've given no justification to believe that the premises of this argument are true.
Well, the justification is that if there is a God, we can't be sure that morals are a thing. I could do the same thing you're doing, just in reverse.
Can you state that argument again? Perhaps I misunderstood it.
Okay, so the reductio ad absurdum is just reversing your argument. If God exists, morals don't exist. Morals exist, or moral knowledge, however you want to put it, and therefore God doesn't exist.
Well, you haven't justified that first premise there.
Yeah,
And
well, no, because if God exists, see, we can't be sure about our morals.
I don't see the justification for that. Why
Well,
can't we be
because
sure
how do
that?
we know that morals are a thing? God might have made morals not exist. The God that's real might make it so that we just think that there's morals when in fact there aren't morals.
Well, the first thing I'd like to do is you're not really doing anything to attacking the truth or justification of the first premise of my
You know
argument.
what a reductio ad absurdum is, though, right?
Yeah, but you're not doing that
Okay,
with
so why is this wrong? Why is the reductio ad absurdum wrong?
Well, I don't think a justification for your first premise works.
Well, I don't think the justification for your first premise works.
Okay, let's explore that. So the problem, again, on atheism is that...
Okay, hold on. There is no under atheism. We're not going to do that.
Given God's not existence, it seems that we would have the same intuitions of morality's existence, regardless of whether morality existed. And that seems to undercut such intuition from properly justifying our belief in morality. So we wouldn't have moral knowledge. You don't seem to have addressed this.
What do you mean by existing here? Because they exist as an object of the mind.
Okay, so this is where I think defining what I mean by morality might come in useful.
Which you didn't do in the argument.
Yeah, that's true. That was probably in the community page. I didn't do it for space considerations. That might have been a mistake. So,
well, the whole argument's a mistake, but you know.
An action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not do it. But we use words like ought and should in a couple different ways. So some oughts are purely descriptive. For example, if you want to do well in school, you ought to
study. Are you reading from a script?
Yeah, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget.
Oh, okay. I see. I'm doing no script, by the way.
Okay. So some oughts are purely descriptive. For example, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. Now, some oughts prescribe in a way that is not purely descriptive. So, for example, someone saying you shouldn't torture infants might be using this type of ought. And this is the top I've ought I'm using my moral semantics. That is that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities.
Okay. So,
well, one important feature of this is that an implication of this is that moral wrongness will be non-natural. It wouldn't be part of the natural physical world.
Why?
Well, facts of chemistry and physics and so forth are purely descriptive, whereas the moral ought is not purely descriptive.
Okay, so we're presupping. Okay, that's what the core is. So this is all just relying on presuppositionalism.
Presupposition of what?
That chemicals and whatnot can't produce things or something of that nature, right?
Can't produce something?
Well,
can't produce what exactly?
Our brains have come up with morals, whether there's a God or not.
Well, they've come up with the ideas of morals.
Right.
But
that's all we need. And that's all your argument is saying, is that these ideas are in existence, which I agree. Those ideas exist. And you're playing all these games with adding, isn't whatever, all this silliness that I don't see as being relevant or connected to God in any way, shape, or form.
Well, the connection, as I mentioned, is that if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist.
I know you said that, but you haven't shown that that's true, though.
Well, what about perhaps this illustration will help with Cyborg.
Okay, we're doing the robot. Well, I was going to say what facts show that moral knowledge leads there to being a God. Associated Constitution already said that, though. So okay. Let's see. Let's bring up robot.
Well, Cyborg, not robot.
And robot, cyborg, whatever.
Okay, so to illustrate why this intuition thing is a problem, suppose a cyborg has a metal detecting implant installed in a brain that's designed so that when a widget is in her hand, the implant delivers a strong intuition that the widget contains metal, if and only if it contains metal. Suppose, however, the metal detecting implant malfunctions such that it would deliver the intuition that the widget contains metal, even if the widget did not contain metal.
Right.
But even if the widget in her hand did contain metal and she believed it contained metal on the basis of her intuition, her belief wouldn't count as knowledge. Moreover, if she learned the metal detecting implant would give her the intuition that the widget contains metal, even if the widget contained no metal, she would no longer have adequate grounds to believe the widget contains metal.
Yeah. Okay. I covered this argument a couple of times.
If you believe that
I covered this argument a couple of times, in my second response, I thought maybe that this at its core is kind of like the C.S. Lewis's argument, where he was like, well, if evolution is true, then we can't really trust our sensory inputs. Is that kind of what's going on here? That we can't really trust what's going on in our brain, or in this case, the robot's programming, to tell us if it's metal or not. Is that, am I on?
This is specifically about moral knowledge, because if you accept that the cyborg does not have knowledge that the widget contains metal, what relevant difference is there between this scenario and the scenario I outlined, where God does not exist and we would have the same intuitions of morality existing regardless of whether morality existed? That doesn't seem like we'd be capable of having knowledge of morality in that case.
Well, we know it exists.
How do we know this? We rely on intuition, but we'd have this intuition regardless of whether morality would exist. And
we still have that problem even if there's a God. So nothing is
That's not relevant on this premise. That doesn't affect the truth or justification of this premise.
Okay, let me ask this for this analogy, since we're appealing to analogy, logical fallacy, but that's okay. Can we test metal?
Can we test whether metal, like something contains metal?
Yeah.
Yes, it seems we have that technology to do so.
Okay, so we can verify independent of the robot if it is or isn't metal. That way we can know if the robot is malfunctioning, right?
Yes, I suppose we could, at least.
Okay, can we do that with humans? Can we detect if the morals, which are substitution for metal, are malfunctioning in some way, shape, or form? How would that detection work?
Well, we can't empirically detect moral wrongness.
Okay, then the analogy is false then. Got it.
Well, okay, what relevant difference, if the analogy is false, what relevant difference is there between this scenario, the cyborg scenario, and the scenario I outlined, such that we would have knowledge of morality?
It doesn't matter. Your analogy has failed.
Well, for that to fail, there has to be a relevant difference between
we can detect metal. Can't we detect morals in the same way?
You mean?
Whatever method you want to use to detect morals, can we do that? Yes
not
or
if
no?
God does not exist.
Okay. Can we do it? Yes or no?
I'm not sure what you mean by detect. I think we can know that morality.
Okay, so you don't know what words mean. Got it. All right. What else? Let's go back to the.
Well, do you agree with the first premise? Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with your silly premise.
Okay.
Because
well,
it's broken.
No, if the first premise is false, then how is that we could know that morality exists if atheism is true? If God does not exist? It doesn't seem like we could. You don't seem to have addressed this particular problem.
Because we know things are that we made. We know numbers exist. We made those. Okay. Do you play chess? Do you know the rules of chess?
Yeah, I know the rules of chess.
Okay. Who made the rules of chess?
We did.
Okay. So how do we know the rules of chess if we made it? How do we know that those rules are really the rules of chess? Same thing, right? We know because we learned it, right? We told each other, here's what the rules are. That's where the knowledge comes from, is each other. We all agree that if we want to play chess, this is how to play it. Now, you and I might come to an agreement on a different version of chess, but setting that possible counterexample to the side, and let's just say for some reason, we all say, look, if you're not playing it this way, you're not really playing chess. Kind of a no true chessman sort of fallacy, but whatever. Okay, so we know that the rules of chess or Monopoly or whatever are those rules, even though we made them up, in the same way we know that morals are a thing that we made up.
Okay, it sounds like you're not using the same definition of morality that I was using in this argument. See, my definition of morality is such that moral laws are not purely descriptive, and as such, moral wrongness would be a non-natural, non-physical property.
There is no such thing as non-natural, non-physical. If there is, you'd have to argue for those things. Then.
Okay, so it seems like you agree with the first premise, but deny the second premise.
No, I disagree with the first premise. There is no... If you can't present a non-physical, non-whatever thing, then those also would have to be argued for. So what's your argument for a non-physical thing? What do you mean by that?
Well, let's first agree with the first... You agree that the first premise is true, right?
No!
Okay, do you agree that... Do you believe that morality does not exist as I've defined it?
I don't know what the difference is of what you think morals are. It seems, are you like going for some Platoist idea of morals?
No. Have you heard of David Hume?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you heard of Hume's is ought problem?
Yeah, so have you heard of what's the guy's paradox? Is it moral because it's moral, or is it moral because it comes from God? That guy,
That sounds like you're referring to Euthyphro. No,
yeah, Euthyphro.
Euthyphro. Now, what the reason why I brought up Hume is because he says, "How do we deduce e naught from an is?" And he specifically had the moral ought in mind. And the reason why it's a problem in the first place is because he believed that the is and the ought were entirely different relations to each other.
I don't care what he believes. Can that be demonstrated to be true?
Well, I think we can point to an example of it, but my point is,
can it be demonstrated to be true?
I think it, in one sense, I think it can.
Okay, so in what sense can it be? Okay, so not to everybody's satisfaction. Why would that be?
Well, some people, it seems, don't have the intuition that it's morally wrong to torture an infant just for fun on my semantics and David Hume's apparent moral semantics.
So okay, why would that be?
Well, I don't know why people don't have the intuition that it's not wrong.
So then there's no God.
Huh?
They don't have that intuition, therefore there's no God.
I think we're getting away from the justifying the truth of premise 1 here.
Well, it's not true. That's the problem.
Okay, so let's think about this analytically now. So you believe that morality, as I've defined it, does not exist, right?
I'm not even sure what your definition of morals are, but it seems to be a bunch of word salad.
So I was using the conception of morality that David Hume had in mind.
The non-justified conception that somebody else came up with. A human that is under human conditions. Okay, cool. So what?
So if you believe that the type of morality I just described does not exist, you're rationally committed to accepting the first premise as true.
No.
Okay, well, I can...
Here's the fallacies that your first premise commits, by the way.
So, do you know what a material implication is? A material conditional?
I don't care. Your first fallacy is... let's see, where did I put those fallacies at? Oh, I wrote them down. That's okay, I can remember them. Circular reasoning. We've got possible equivocation. We've got... well, we've got non sequitur at the end, but that's the last thing, of course, But basically, this is precept in a nutshell. It's just wordplay, and it's like, how do I get an is from a not? How do I do this? And you can't just say, look, morals are rules we came up with, right?
No, that's not the definition of morality I'm using in this argument.
Okay, well,
I'm using that type of thought that does not have only descriptive qualities.
You're using a version of morals that you can use to get to your conclusion. So you're equivocating on morals in such a way.
I'm not equivocating morals. This is the same definition I'm using throughout the argument.
Well, yeah, but it's a different version of morals than somebody else might use. So isn't that a problem?
No, that's not a problem. It doesn't affect the truth or justification of any premise in the argument. Now, if you think the first premise is false, what is the relevant difference?
Well, it is false because, what about the logical fallacy of circular reasoning?
There is no premise that assumes the truth of the conclusion.
Yes, it does.
Okay, which premise assumes the truth of the conclusion?
The first one.
Okay, well, no, it doesn't. The first premise is compatible with God not existing.
What?
Look at the first premise. Is that premise compatible with God not existing and moral knowledge not existing? The first premise is...
You're assuming that something we know, something we already know about. Like I said, you could say that lobsters don't exist. You could say if God doesn't exist, then lobsters don't exist. But lobsters do exist, therefore God exists. It's the same argument. Exactly the same.
You haven't answered my question. Is God not existing compatible with the first premise?
God not existing has no bearing on whether morals exist or not.
Well, remember, you said the first premise begs the question. However, if the first premise is compatible with the conclusion being false, then it doesn't beg the question, right?
That's not how that works. But
well, how does it beg the question if it's fully compatible with God not existing?
I thought you studied logic.
I did.
Why did you make this broken argument then?
This argument is logically valid.
But it's not sound.
Well, for it to be unsound, there needs to be a false premise. So which
premise? That's premise one.
Okay, let's just... Well, you haven't addressed the justification I've given for this.
But the justification is outside of the argument, so it doesn't stand on its own, so it fails.
No, If the justification implies that the first premise is probably true, then it works, right?
No, because it's outside of the argument. You would need another argument to justify the first premise.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, who cares? It's logic. Whatever.
Well, as long as the justification shows that the premise, so a sound argument is a logically valid argument with true premises, right?
Yeah, I know that. Yes.
Okay, so if I show, even if it's in a separate argument, even if I show that if the premises are true, then I show that the argument is sound, right?
But you didn't do that.
Okay, so I gave a justification for the first premise, and you haven't
not
quite
in this
arrested as far as I can see.
I did.
All right, well,
I asked you lots of questions, but you seem to be kind of shifting the issue around and just throwing more word salad at it in desperate attempts to make morals into some weird thing that I don't recognize, that I can't really interact with. And I suppose that's why you're into philosophy, so that you can use those, over the top words. So what ethical system would this fall under then?
It doesn't specify. So perhaps if I
that's interesting. That's interesting, because there's a lot of ethical systems, but only one would actually be the actual ethical system if there's a God, right? Which would be
I don't
DCT.
think that's true. This argument doesn't specify. The justification for the first premise is that there is no relevant difference between that cyborg scenario and the scenario I described.
But we can detect metal, and I already said that the analogy. Can we detect morals?
Okay, so the justification for the first.
Can we detect morals?
There is a sense I think we can. However,
okay, how does that work? How do we detect morals?
We rely on moral intuition to know that, for example, it's wrong to torture an infant just for fun.
How do you know that moral intuition is correct?
I have the same reason I know that my intuition for sense experience memory is reliable.
So you don't necessarily know that it is correct.
I think I do know that it's correct in the same way I know that my sense experience is at least somewhat reliable.
But they could be wrong.
It's not logically impossible for it to be wrong in that sense.
Okay.
Now, the justification for the first premise is that there's no relevant difference between the cyborg scenario and what we could call the atheism scenario, in which the cyborg does not have knowledge.
There is no atheism anything.
Okay, the God does not exist scenario. We could call it that then. There is no relevant difference between the cyborg scenario and the God does not exist scenario, such that the cyborg does not have knowledge.
Except for that we can't really detect morals.
And the God does not exist. We do have more knowledge. There is no relevant difference.
How do we detect morals?
I've already answered this question. I said moral intuition.
But you can't trust moral intuition because your brain, or the robot's brain, might have not been programmed correctly. So you can't trust your intuition. So how do you test morals? We can do that outside of the robot with the metal. So can we do it outside of humans to test morals in some shape, way, or form like we can with metal?
I don't think bare possibility of being incorrect is sufficient grounds to believe that we
can. We do that? Yes or no?
Outside of moral intuition?
Yes.
I don't think we can do that any more than we can do.
Okay, then your analogy fails, and you should not appeal to analogy, because that's a logical fallacy, another one that you've made. But that's okay. Apologists always make logical fallacies for some reason. I don't know why. I guess that's what happens when you have a thing that isn't really real in reality, like God, as your conclusion. That's the problem. You're trying to argue for something that is just a concept in the head and nothing more, and so you're bound to use logical fallacies to get to it. Moral knowledge, the thing that we have in our head that we humans invented, that evolved through time with us, is definitely a thing. And you wanted to say, well, I can't really trust my moral intuition unless there's a God, but then I still can't trust my moral intuition even if there is a God, which we already agreed on. So it doesn't solve anything.
So I'm afraid you still haven't quite addressed my if you could allow me to explain my justification for that first premise. So here's how the justification works. In the cyborg scenario, the cyborg's intuition does not deliver knowledge for the metallic widget belief. If the cyborg's the next premise is, if the cyborg's intuition does not deliver knowledge in the cyborg scenario, then if God does not exist, moral intuition does not deliver knowledge for morality's existence. And therefore, if God does not exist, moral intuition does not deliver knowledge from reality's existence. Now, which premise of that logically valid argument do you dispute?
How do we have knowledge about it if there's where does this knowledge thing, what do you, okay, so bringing up the broken analogy again, I guess, because
I actually showed you this argument before, but you haven't replied to it, and so far you haven't responded to any premise of that particular argument.
So, okay, we can test the metal separately from the robot, which we cannot apparently do with morals. So the analogy already fails. So I'm not going to even call it metal anymore. I'm going to call it some made-up name, you know, blah, whatever. And is it blah? Well, we have no way to test the metal, so we have to rely completely on the robot's intuition about that this is correctly metal. And that works because why?
You don't seem to be addressing my argument here.
Okay, is that your argument, though? That this is flargle, okay? Because we have no way to test flargle outside of the robot's intuition, which could be wrong, but if there's a magical being that we have no proof of, that somehow makes it able to know that Margle Bargle is an actual thing.
No, the key premise you haven't addressed yet is that if the cyborg's intuition does not deliver knowledge in the cyborg scenario, then moral intuition does not deliver knowledge from reality's existence, and the God does not exist scenario.
Knowledge is knowing that this thing is a thing, right? Like, what do you mean by knowledge? Like, what do you mean there? Are you saying that you know that he's wrong about it? He's wrong about it being metal. So it's not knowledge.
No, knowledge is properly justified true belief.
Okay, so he could hold a false belief about that. Okay, cool.
No, that's not quite. The bare possibility of false belief doesn't mean that knowledge doesn't exist. Like, for example, have you heard of the brain and vat scenario? Like, which we already agreed that lobsters exist, so we're already past that. I don't think that addresses the brain and vat scenario at all. That's
lobsters existing negates the whole brains and vat silliness.
No, I don't think you quite understand.
Okay, well then we can't have a discussion then. If you can't agree that lobsters exist, we're done.
I do agree that lobsters
exist. Then we're not brains and vats. That's silliness. It's nonsense. I'm not going there.
My point is that the bare possibility of intuitions being false doesn't mean that we can't trust those intuitions. Otherwise, we couldn't get out of the brain and vat situations. You couldn't trust your intuitions that your sense experience is reliable.
And we can't always trust our sensory input. That's why you should be a skeptic and not a theist.
You mean you don't believe, but you believe that lobsters exist. You're not skeptical about that.
Yeah, because we have empirical evidence, repeatable tests, and a valid and sound
argument. That requires trusting your intuition that your sense experience is reliable.
No, because we can do outside tests for it as well.
No, you have to trust your intuition that your sense experience is reliable. What outside tests can you do?
That's what science does.
Well, for science to work, you have to trust that your sense experience is at least sometimes reliable.
I have to. That's why we have multiple people working on it. Now,
to believe that there are multiple people, you have to believe that your sense experience is reliable.
If it's not reliable, then somebody hopefully will be able to figure that out. But that somebody won't be me. And this happens.
How do you know that there are other people? You have to trust your intuition that your senses of other people are accurate, right?
And God doesn't solve that problem, does it?
I never said it did.
Right, exactly. So moral intuition, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, this silly little game is that somehow God existing allows this thing to be actually a flargle, and that the robot can now trust its intuition because why?
No, that's not the argument. The argument is that if God is not, the part of the argument, the premise that we were disputing is that if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. And part of my justification for that premise is that cyborg illustration, you say it's a false analogy, but remember, the key premise here is that if the cyborg's intuition does not deliver knowledge in the cyborg scenario, then moral intuition does not deliver knowledge for morality existence in the God does not exist scenario.
So,
do you agree that this premise is true?
So the robot might detect that the metal is not actually, or the flargle isn't really flargle, and because its intuition was wrong. Now, it doesn't have to be wrong all the time, by the way, but it was wrong in that case.
That doesn't seem to address
what I don't know, just off the top of my head, stoning people to death seems to me like a really bad idea. But I could be wrong about that. But the thing that but I don't see a reason why I'm wrong about that. Now, I base that on the fact that humans like to exist. And that we like to exist seems to mean that we have to rely on each other for continual existence, which means we have to enhance each other's existence in such a way that ensures their existence and selfishly my own existence. So me stoning somebody to death might mean that I get stoned to death. So I go, wait a minute, this isn't really a good idea. So it's probably a bad idea. And we all go, yeah, that sounds right. Well, unless God says to do it, then I guess it's perfectly fine. Because DCT is broken as an ethical system, which is the ethical system you're stuck with if there's a God. But you can avoid that problem by just going, well, I'm not talking about ethics, I'm talking about knowledge of this thing. Well, but the robot doesn't have knowledge of the thing, whether there's a God or not, because its brain can still go wrong.
This doesn't seem to be attacking this premise at all. Do you agree with the premise I just said?
We're just going in circles.
We haven't gone in circles. You just haven't addressed the justification.
No, I did several times, but
no, this premise. What was your justification for this premise? That if the cyborg's intuition does not deliver knowledge in the cyborg scenario, then moral intuition does not deliver knowledge from morality existence in the God does not exist scenario. What was your justification? You didn't seem to address this at all.
It doesn't necessarily know that that's true. That's the same whether there's a God or not. We already agreed on that. So how does God fix it? And
this premise doesn't say that God fixes the problem. It just says that
then the argument fails.
Well, if the premises are true, then the argument is sound. You said yeah, okay, you said premise one is false. You disagreed with it. So I gave justification for it. That justification was that that premise, and you have not addressed this premise yet.
I did several times. I said there's no association, causation, linkage given. Okay, you already admitted that. You don't have. You need another argument for this premise. You already acknowledged that.
Okay, let's
God doesn't solve any of this. You already acknowledged that, basically. So this argument and your analogy are broken, as always.
Is this premise true? If that if the cyborg's intuition does not
the premise is broken, so it can't. Well, we don't know if it's true, but we know it's broken.
If it's true, then we have a justification for the first premise.
There's fallacies all over the place with that premise. Like circular reasoning, because basically you start with God, you end with God, but whatever.
No, the first premise doesn't assume that God exists, remember?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, think about it. If the first premise assumes that God exists, is God not existing compatible with the first premise?
You're assuming that God exists because you're tying it into something that we know does exist.
Okay, if the first premise begs the question, it assumes God's existence, then God does not exist would be incompatible with the first premise, right?
What? That's not okay. I don't know where you learned.
You said the first premise assumed the conclusion, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, does God does not exist compatible with the first premise?
Does God did not exist compatible with the first premise?
If the non-existence of God is compatible with the first premise, then the first premise does not assume the conclusion, correct?
If God does not exist, which is what the premise already says, wouldn't it be if God does exist?
No, the first premise doesn't say either way whether God exists. If the first premise assumes the truth and conclusion,
like I said, the first premise could be if apples exist, then God exists. Like
well, it's not. So let's look at the premise.
There's no tie between the two. That's the thing. There's no connection.
You said that the
connect 1 to 2. You go, God is real because this other thing I know is real, and here's God at the bottom. So you start with God, you end with God. That's begging the question.
Okay, the first
premise, whatever you're saying here, I don't recognize whatever that is that you're doing, because that's not what circular logic is. I don't know where you're getting that idea from.
You said the first premise assumes the conclusion, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Because it has God in it.
Okay, so if the first premise assumes the conclusion, then the falsity of the conclusion would be incompatible with the first premise, right?
No, that's not. No.
You think that God existing is compatible with the first premise, but the first premise assumes the conclusion?
I can't help you. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the other questions I wanted to ask just for funsies.
Well, you haven't addressed my...
I don't care anymore. I'm done with you. There's no way to fix you. You're broken. I would suggest you take this to a professor, since you're apparently going to school. Take this argument to a professor of logic and ask them how broken it is, and they'll fix it for you. I can't help you. Maybe you need to redo logic, because I don't think you understand what a circular logical fallacy is.
I've taken 4 semesters in logic in college.
I don't believe you.
Proficient in. Well, I could explain to you. Well, with all due respect, you don't even know what a material conditional is. That's quite important.
I don't believe you, because your argument's so fundamentally broken, and because you don't seem to know what logical fallacies are in the case of a circular argument.
I could prove that the argument is logically valid in symbolic logic if you doubt my logic proficiency.
Yeah, it's valid. I agree, but it's not sound. But I don't believe that you've gone to school for this. You'd have to prove that.
I can prove it. I could prove it using symbolic logic.
No, I want you to prove that you went to the school with some documentation.
Do you want me to? How would I prove with my doc? Do you want me to email my transcripts?
That would work.
I suppose I could do that. Seems a bit odd, but
yeah, because I'd like to reach out to your professors of logic and ask them about your argument and see what they have to say about it, because I don't think that you'll bring it to them.
So
have you brought this argument to any professor of logic?
A lot? No, I don't think so. But,
why not?
Well, the subject matter wouldn't be so. Logic is focused on like formal matters. So like symbolic logic. It wouldn't deal with content. This
okay, so you're taking formal logic, not informal logic, then.
Well, I did deal with some informal logic, but it's mostly formal logic.
So wouldn't a professor of formal also know informal logic, I would think?
Oh, they likely would have some knowledge of informal logic.
So why not bring this to them?
Well, I haven't really seen the need to do that. This is philosophy religion, not logic proper.
Okay. Well, email me the transcripts, but better yet, on top of that, email me a way to contact one or more of your logic professors so I can ask them what they think of your argument, because I don't think that you have the guts to do that.
So just to recap, my justification for the first premise is that...
Okay, we're done with that. We're moving on. I want to know, what age do you think the Earth is? What age do you think the universe is? And do you agree with the scientific facts of biological evolution by natural selection?
Well, I think natural selection was one of the mechanisms, but I don't think it was the only one. I think there's also endogenous retroviruses, there's genetic drift, there's sexual solution. Evolution is actually a lot more complicated.
That's all that, I would think, but yeah. So
no, it's not just natural selection. There's also the genetic...
You're fine with science. You're fine with biological evolution. You don't have a problem with it. You're not one of those people, right? So you're cool with it, yeah? It's not like you're like ID or creationism nonsense and any of that. Oh, evolution's just a theory. You're not one of those people, yeah?
I do believe in evolution.
Okay, cool. What age do you think the Earth is? What age do you think the universe is?
I would say the universe is somewhere between 10 to 15 billion years old. I think the Earth is 4 to 6 billion years old. I don't know what the elite.
Okay, so you're fine with science. So at least you're not one of those. But when it comes to this argument and logic in general, I don't know that I can really explain to you how broken this argument is.
Well, if you use symbolic logic, I think that would help. Do you know symbolic
logic? I'm not going to do that. I can't do that live. That takes time. That's hard. That takes truth really tables.
For this, it's not really that hard.
No, I'm not going to do that live. I wouldn't be able to do a decent job doing it live. I'd have to do that off thing, but I'm not gonna bother because you haven't shown any causal link, and basically, I think what we're reduced to, in all honesty, the brute end all of this argument is that somehow you think that we can have knowledge of the thing only if there's a God, but I don't know why that would be the case, because whether there's a God or not, we might not have knowledge of the thing.
Well, bare possibility isn't enough. As the brain of that experiment shows, the bare possibility of moral intuition is not enough to doubt it.
All right. Well, as far as I can tell, you've given no empirical evidence, repeatable tests, or valid and sound argument for what God is in the first place. And this argument certainly doesn't qualify. So because of that,
you didn't even
and because it's a mixed hypothetical syllogism, I can just ignore premise one anyways and throw it out and say, well, it's not true. And I do. So until you can show that there's an actual thing, God, I don't care. And you'd also have to have another argument, which you didn't have in your post, for me to analyze, that has moral knowledge and God being the conclusion. So if you want to throw that up somewhere for me to look at.
Oh, I did. I do have an article on there that I posted in July 2017.
Okay, you can email me that and I'll analyze that probably offline and then post my analysis online, because I cannot analyze live. It just doesn't work for me. I've done it before. But as far as I can determine, based on this, I do not currently have a sound argument for God. I certainly don't have any empirical evidence, repeatable tests for God, which I've always wondered why that's the case. Why there is no those things for God when there is for everything else. It just is bizarre. And my intuition suggests that God is just an object of the mind, a very useful idea, perhaps, or dangerous idea, but that's all it is. It's like a number or musical note, and that's it. Why can't it just be that? I don't know why it has to be more than that. And since we can't really trust our senses all the time, well, why would we trust that there's a God when we know that people make up gods all the time? So, I'm still skeptical of your conclusion. But thank you for your time and energy to talk to me. This was interesting, if not word salary. I'm going to see if chat has anything that they'd like to ask you or whatever, and see if any of that's relevant or not. And we'll just go over those questions if I see any questions. Nitty said that this was begs the question of moral realism. Seems like it. It's just like, if God gives moral facts, then God exists. I mean,
that wasn't my premise.
Yeah. Let's see. This person says something that is purely circular. What? I don't even know how to respond to that. That wasn't a question, but okay. Just sometimes people, let's see. Nerdy wrote it. Let's see. How do you get to the ought moral knowledge from the is a factual claim about a God? Okay, I'll let you answer that in full.
So I don't deduce an ought from an is. I start with the moral ought. That's something that's pretty basic. It just seems to me, for example, that it's wrong to torture an infant just for fun. I don't deduce an ought from an is.
Okay. How can you write a premise that confuses I can't read anymore. Epistemology with ontology.
I don't think my premise does that. If Dirty Rhoda could explain how my premise does that, perhaps I'd be better able to answer his question.
All right, yeah, because it may be kind of a loaded-ish question there, but if there's no God, well, we can both answer this. If there's no God, then how can you trust anything? Well, whether there's a God or not, we can't necessarily. Sometimes our sensory inputs fail us. We know that. I had to get glasses recently, although these glasses don't really function quite correctly. So we know that our senses sometimes fail us. And we know that there are humans who have brain injuries or chemicals that affect their behavior. So it certainly is the case that sometimes, and we don't know how often, our brain fails us, that our perception of reality isn't quite correct. I myself experienced that once. I went to hit a guy, which I regret, but in that moment, time seemed to slow. Now, time didn't slow down for real. That was just in my head. That's how my brain processed that moment. And I knew that time wasn't really slowing down for real in that moment because I still had my other cognitive faculties around to say, well, this is kind of cool that I'm seeing it in slow motion, even though it's not in slow motion. I thought it was really neat. But sometimes our intuition is wrong. We think, oh, I should go right. Well, actually should have gone left, and we're wrong about it. We make wrong decisions. Whether there's a God or not, it doesn't seem to solve the problem of it. And yes, everything is chemical reactions. Don't appeal to consequence as a way to get out of the problem. If there's no God, then this thing is true, and I don't want that thing to be true. Yes, everything is chemical reactions. That's how it is. Whether there's a God or not, it's still chemical reactions. So, do you want to address that question? I'll let you address the question because I think that's only fair if for you to address the question as well.
Well, I do think, there's kind of like if God does not exist, we have this problem like, how could we know anything? And that would give us, that's a whole nother box of worms that would have to be unloaded.
Well, I would say that we should be skeptical. Let's see. What's the best way to conflate moral epistemology with moral ontology? I think he already said that. Let's see.
So one mistake I realized that I made here is I probably should have directed you to that blog post where I give a deductively valid argument for the first premise. I tried to explain that here, but I'll just say it didn't work out too well.
Yeah. Yeah, this was in response to God is in everyone, and they said that's great. Why doesn't God reveal Himself? Yeah, that would be, again. We wouldn't need any of these debates. We wouldn't need argumentations if God was blatantly obvious, and it just isn't because reasons, and those reasons will differ from religion to religion. Of course, my answer is God's here in the brain. That's why it doesn't reveal itself, because it can't. Let's see. What year is it? Oh, God, that question, really?
I believe it's 2025.
Yeah. So this question is basing it off of the calendar, and different societies use different calendars, and this is the calendar that won out. That doesn't mean that Jesus did stuff or whatever. It's just a nonsense sort of thing that people throw out there. Anyways, we already answered the question, or he answered the question. He's on the side of science. He's an old Earth he's a realist when it comes to the age of the Earth and universe and biological evolution. And I'm by the way, Maverick, props to you on that. I'm very glad that you're on that side. Even though we disagree on this argument and in God in general, I'm glad that we both agree on science, and that makes me a little bit hopeful for the future. So good on you for that.
Thank you.
Let's see. I'm looking for a question. Okay, so that was it. I guess there was no other questions. Anyone have any questions for Maverick before we finish? Because I just don't know what else I could say I think that this kind of getting a little esoteric, beyond my pay grade, if you will. Anyone? Post a question. Post questions now. Go, go, go. Only professionalism in my streams. I'm very weird. Oh, I love that. I just don't know God, that's all. Yeah, oh well. If only God would say hi to me, then I could know that there's a God, but it hasn't. So, I don't know. And somebody else said, I was yelling and stuff. I'm hyperbolic. I'm very passionate. I'm very excitable. I'm very loud. And I care about logic and formal logic specifically. Formal logic, I'm still trying to learn. And I get things wrong all the time. But when I look at these arguments for God, and I've been looking at them for a long time, and in this case, I fail to see any link between morals and God. And fair enough to Maverick, this is only a partial argument, perhaps. You said that you have more written on this that I didn't look at. I think an argument should stand or fail on its own merits. I think the function of logic is kind of like math in a way, Okay, so this is a question. Here we go. The Bible says, seek and you shall find. Do you think that those seeking and not finding aren't looking hard enough, or they aren't genuinely seeking, or rather seeking to disprove? Interesting question.
I don't know to that. It might be that Jesus was only speaking to a particular group of people when he said, seek and you shall find. And he might have only talking about seeking certain things. I'd have to look up the Bible context. I don't think he was talking about like belief in God in general. I imagine he was talking about something else.
Possibly. Rudolph, how could a Christian go to sleep at night when he doesn't know if he'll wake up in his bed or in hell tomorrow? Well, I guess that'd be true of anybody. To tangential to that, I suppose I had a nightmare recently where my brain imploded. I woke up screaming. I'm like, well, that sucked. What was up with that? And I'm like, can brains implode? It turns out brains cannot implode. So, but it was weird. I don't like the idea of not existing, but I have experienced it, even though it's weird. Like I went under for surgery. Have you ever gone under, Maverick?
Yeah, a couple times.
Yeah, and I tried to really focus on the moment before leading up to it, and all I remember is like this fuzzy thing in my head, and I'm like, "Oh, that's an interesting sensation." And the next thing I know, I'm being woken up. So there wasn't me, and I didn't even know that there wasn't me until I was back. And now I'm like, oh, reflecting on it, I can see that there's time missing, but I didn't even know that I wasn't there to not know. It's so, and if that's what it's like, then it's not like anything. And only because I'm currently existing can I go, I don't like that idea. So, but there's not much I can do about it, as far as, if there's infinite time, then maybe our molecules will come together again and will exist again, because infinite time means infinite possibilities, but I doubt that. So I don't know. I'm skeptical about all the afterlife stuff, including that nothing happens. I don't know. I have no idea. And that scares me too. I don't like it. Death is bad. Bad death. Maybe science will figure that out. Maybe not. Yeah, the context is that if you seek God, God will reveal. Well, if you look for something hard enough, you might find it, but that doesn't make it real. It's just, if you want it to be true, you might convince yourself it's true. That was an addition to your previous question, Maverick. Okay, so he expanded, Maverick. Hello? Okay. Maverick, he expanded his question to add knock on the door will be open to you, and that he thought that context would be in seeking God, God would reveal himself.
Maybe I'd have to look at the passage more in depth. I'm more of a philosopher than I am like a New Testament scholar, and I'm not even really a philosopher quite yet. I'm still working on my master's.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Let's see. Oh, geez. Which of my ex-wives will I spend eternity with? I hope not both, because they don't like each other very much.
Well, if there is a hell, and if you all go there, I guess it'll work out that way. But I'm optimistically going to assume that won't be the case.
Yeah. Hell is other people.
Oh, yeah, I read that. That's a pretty good play if you haven't read it.
Yeah.
Read that for my existentialism class.
Yeah, as a philosopher, I'm wondering what you might think of this, that God is posited as a perfectly logical being in Christianity. Am I right about that or not? Because I think
I would generally assume that most Christians would affirm that. Christianity itself is very diverse. There's like over 2 billion of us.
Right. But okay, you would accept that, I would, right? That
yeah, God I would assume that he's logical. Yes.
Yeah, but I think God uses logical fallacies, and so that means God isn't perfectly logical, which negates God.
I don't see why you would think that God makes well, I suppose you can come up with a conception of God in which God does make logical fallacies.
Yeah, well, God uses an ad ballum and an appeal to bribe.
Appeal to I don't think. I suppose you can make up, like I said, you can make up a view of God where he does make fallacies, but you can also come up with a view of God where he does not make fallacies.
Right, but I mean, when if there's a hell, that's an ad ballum, and if there's a heaven, that's an appeal to bribery. So
I don't see how either of those are fallacies in and of themselves. A fallacy is an error in reasoning. So what can you construct the argument you think God is making?
He's appealing to threat of hell if you don't do this thing.
Well, that's not an argument. It just says if you do wrong, if you're evil, if you're an evil bastard, I'll punish you. That doesn't seem to be a fallacy in and of itself.
That's an ad ballum, though. If you don't do X thing, I'm gonna hurt you.
I don't see how that's a fallacy, and fallacy is an error in reasoning. Can you construct the argument you think that you're describing?
It's an ad ballum. God, if you don't do this thing, believing in God in a certain way, shape, and form, you're going to hell. All non-Christians, 33% of the world is Christian. All the rest of us, screwed. We're all doomed.
Well, I should say that not all Christians believe that. There are some Christian universalists.
Okay. Are you one of those?
I don't know whether universalism is true, but I hope it is.
Okay. Well, under it's still, even whether there's universalism or not, it seems that this is a threat of some sort. If you don't believe in me, you this thing will happen to you.
Fortunately, I don't adhere to that belief. I don't believe in a God that adheres to that belief.
And then the opposite, then, great. We don't have an ad ballum. We still have the appeal to bribe, which is if you do this thing, then you get this great reward.
Oh, okay. And so that's okay. So remember, a fallacy is an error in reasoning,
right?
And an argument has one or more premises, and it has a conclusion. Can you describe the premise and the conclusion for this
premise? The premise is that God is, or Jesus, or whoever is saying that if you do this thing, this very specific thing of believing in a certain way and maybe getting baptized in full immersion or whatever you have to do to be saved, that nobody can agree on. But if you do that, then you get this wonderful reward.
Okay, that's the premise. What's the conclusion?
That if you do this thing that I want you to do, you get this wonderful reward.
Okay, so the premise is if you do this wonderful thing, then you get this reward. And the conclusion is if you do this wonderful thing, then you will get this reward. Is that right? Is that the argument?
Yeah.
Well, that argument is is logically valid.
It's an appeal to a bribe, though. I'm bribing you. I'm like, hey, if you lick my foot, I'll give you a house.
Well, the fact that it's a bribe doesn't make the argument any less valid, right?
But it's not sound because it's a fallacy.
For it to be sound, then the argument would have to be, the premise would have to be false. And so it seems that the problem is the false premise, not the fact that there is an error in reasoning, because the argument is logical. The reasoning is valid. The reasoning is logically valid.
The God is offering a bribe for us to do a thing, right? Basically, that's how I see it. I mean, I could be wrong, but seems like, hey, if you do this thing, I'll give you this big reward.
Okay, so more specifically, when I say a fallacy is an error in reasoning, a reasoning goes from step A to step B. So a fallacy would mean you go from step A to step B illicitly. There is an error in that step process.
Yeah, and that's what's going on here.
Okay, but if that were the case, then step B would have to not follow from step A, right?
Hey, do you know what appeal to a bribe is? When someone offers you a bribe, let's see. Here's some appeals to bribe. Well, that's not a very good one. Let's see. Fallacy of persuasion by bribery, gifts, or favors. So they're being persuaded by the bribe rather than a logical, non-emotional, non-bribe reason. So God could have said something like, if you believe in me, that'd be really nice. By the way, whether you believe in me or not, you get this cool reward at the end of life. And then it's not a bribe anymore. You get it regardless, you know? So it just seems to me like it's a bribe, but it's interesting how you get around that. So that's interesting that your way of thinking about that. That's
the argument you described is logically valid. For it to be a fallacy, there has to be an error in the reasoning process.
And there is, but okay.
Okay, well, what I could prove it using symbolic logic. The argument is logically valid.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the rule of logic would be known as reiteration. We can use a rule of logic known as reiteration to derive the conclusion from the premise.
Go ahead.
That's it. I just proved that the argument is valid with that logical rule of reiteration. Do you know what the rule of reiteration is?
Anyways, I my brain is cooked. Well, thanks for your time and energy. I don't know why you turned off your camera, but oh well, maybe something.
Yeah, it's just some sort of. I tried turning it on. It's back on again. There was some kind of weird error message when it during the live stream.
All right. Well, I still don't believe in God, so you know, make a better argument. All right. Take care, and we'll make sure to subscribe to Maverick if you want to see more of his stuff. I'll link to his channel. I don't know if I included it or not, but I'll make sure to do that. I don't know that I have your channel, but I'll get it from you. And that's it, everybody. Goodbye!
Bye.
My brain is exploding. Lobsters might exist. I don't know. End stream.